Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to teach you how to perform the first in the series of the Modified Pilates Side Kick. Now the clue's in the name with that title. It's an exercise performed lying on your side. And side lying exercises in general can be fraught with problems, both in terms of how you set yourself up on the mat and making sure that you're comfortable and efficiently aligned, but also because it targets muscles in and around the lateral hip, amongst other things. And that's an area which can be very afflicted with pain, weakness, deconditioning, compression. All of those things can really hamper your efforts to do efficient exercise. And it's something I've seen a lot where side lying exercises actually become very counterproductive and unhelpful. So if you're new to this type of exercise, or you've suffered with that sort of thing before, take a look at the video I've done showing you how to prepare yourself properly before you begin that exercise, and I've left the link below this video. There's also another link to a video that is almost like an entry-level side kick for those of you who've really struggled or who get quite prevaricating pain quite quickly when you attempt side lying exercises. So have a look at those if you find those helpful. But with regards to this one, I'll see you down on the mat in just a moment, and if you know that you need a head cushion or the like, then have one of those on standby. Okay, for the side kick, the knees are bent to about 90 degrees, and if you were looking from above, there'd be about a 20-degree angle in your hip joint. So often it means just taking those feet back behind you slightly, so you've opened up the hips a little bit. The start position has the top hand resting lightly in front of you, making sure that you don't grip too hard into the floor. I prefer using my hand as a little head support here, but the important thing is that the neck is pretty neutral, i.e. parallel to the floor, and we don't want it up or down from that position. Remember, we're looking for a nice parallel spine as well, so just give that little support, that little gap underneath the waistline, and draw in those lower abdominal muscles and bring in that gentle core activation before you start. Now the first in the series of the modified side kick brings the top leg up to hip height. From there, you draw your thigh forwards, keeping the knee at that fixed bend, and then draw the leg backwards. And then we continue in that pattern. Breathe out for one direction and breathe in for another. Here you imagine that you're almost sliding that top leg over a coffee table so that the thigh and the foot stay at the same height as you're performing your side kick movement. Now there's the basic exercise. There are a number of things which I think are helpful to think about here, because it's very easy to go beyond the point at which you actually have sufficient control to get benefit from this exercise. So let's talk about that a little bit more in depth now. One thing I see very commonly when I'm teaching the side kick is as people roll the leg forwards, they lose control of that neutral lumbopelvic position, which is our Pilates center. And you'll see something very telling happening here. As you do that, the knee will drop on that gesture leg, and critically, the heel of the bottom leg will lift from the floor as that rolling movement happens in conjunction with that pelvic roll forwards. That's a sure sign you've gone past the point at which your core muscles can withstand the weight of the leg and the movement of the leg, and therefore you've gone into that kind of inefficient territory. Something similar on the way back, if you take your leg beyond the point at which you've either got flexibility through the anterior hip structures or control with your core muscles, the bottom thigh will lift as the rear foot drops from that parallel position. So I often tell people it can be very helpful to think more about what the bottom leg is doing rather than the top leg. In addition to that, you've got the sensation through that supporting hand. If you take your leg beyond that point where you can hold with your core, you're going to feel a real bearing down into the floor with those fingertips as you really try and counteract the weight of the leg. Similarly, if you go back too far, you're going to feel that hand lightening a little bit, and these are all indicators as to how you would judge the correct movement. I'll talk through more modifications at the tail end of this video, but One thing which is quite helpful to illustrate those points I just made is to perform your side kick with the top hand not supporting on the floor, typically on the waist, and therefore you've lost that base of support and you've got much more kind of insight as to whether you're keeping still. So as I perform this movement, I can really feel that my bottom leg wants to pivot and roll, and I know that's in conjunction with the temptation to lose control in the pelvis. Thinking about the bottom heel staying connected as I bring the leg forwards, and the thigh staying nicely imprinted onto the mat as I go backwards. So there's the basic side kick level 1 from the Modified Pilates program. I'll talk through some modifications for that now, just so you've got a few other things to get your teeth into. Okay, there was the basic side kick technique. On to some modifications. So one way you can very easily make any Pilates exercise more challenging is by adding speed. So if we take our basic side kick movement and we start increasing the cadence slightly, I can really feel that I'm already being challenged to maintain that neutral position. And you want to imagine like you're trying to balance a glass of water on that top pelvic ridge while you're performing your side kick. If the top hand is brought off the floor, then that increased pace becomes much more challenging, and I'm having to really work to maintain that Pilates center. And this kind of merges into something like a nice running drill or a running specific exercise. For those of you who are pretty fit and strong in your lateral hip muscles, then the addition of resistance can make a really increased challenge come about very quickly. So with an exercise loop or resistance band just tied around the thighs, performing my side kick at the normal pace, I can feel that all of those muscles in and around my pelvic girdle and thighs have woken up to a much higher degree. If I increase the pace, it's just going to add in that conditioning, that endurance factor to all of the muscles involved. Still make sure though, if you're using your resistance bands or the like, that you're keeping that thigh nice and parallel, the foot and knee are tracking at the same height, and that you're trying to keep that lovely dissociation of movement which typifies the side kick sequence. That movement we're doing, the parallel to the floor, it's replicating what happens when we walk and run. So that's why it's really important to maintain that equity in the foot and knee height. Now those variations are based on for people who want to make it more difficult. If you struggle with your side kick and you find that you can only do a few repetitions before you get significant fatigue creeping in, then using various things to support can be very helpful. Lots of you might have a little football or basketball nestled around. If you're going to use something to support the top leg, it often means you just need to bring that bottom leg forwards out of the way and rest your shin, your calf area, on the ball, and then you can perform your side kick with that little bit of support. Now you might think that that kind of completely negates the point of doing it, but you can really focus into that lumbopelvic stability, keeping that beautiful center alignment, especially when you go back into hip extension. That's as your thigh moves backwards. This is where you're going to be stretching those anterior hip muscles and one of the quadriceps, and as you go back, it will want to arch your back and tip that pelvis forwards. So when you're taking that leg backwards into extension, think about keeping that belt line pulled up towards your ribcage just to counteract with your abdominal muscles, and then you get this lovely sense of stretch. And this is where this modification for the side kick really comes into its own. Now some of you might have a foam roller at home, which I tend to prefer. It gives a really nice feel to your side kick sequence, and you can perform exactly the same technique, moving that bottom leg forwards to get it out of the way, making sure you're centered still, and then going into that lovely stretch, and you get that really nice fluidity with the roller where you're just moving away. You do need to make sure that the roller is angled correctly, otherwise you're going to find your leg will straighten as you perform this or overly bend, but you can really get some lovely dynamic stretching combined with that core control as you perform your side kick exercise. So there we've covered at the end some modifications for those of you who find it quite challenging, and some modifications at the beginning with speed and resistance added in to make it that extra bit harder if you find the basic side kick level 1 too simple. There are plenty more levels in the side kick to challenge everyone, and I'll talk through those in other videos, but hopefully you've really got the gist of why it's important to get that dissociation of movement and how this movement is replicating something we do when we're up on our feet. So that's why the side kick is a great exercise. Just please make sure, as I discussed earlier and in the other videos linked below, that you don't push into that searing, burning pain which is very common on the outer hip, and you're not going into excessive fatigue when you're doing this type of thing. It can be really counterproductive and it will catch up with you if you're not careful. So hopefully all the points discussed in all of the videos listed here go some way to making sure that doesn't happen to you. Any questions though, feel free to leave them in the comments, but enjoy your Pilates side kick.